In this video, we'll be examining tort law, so I'll be giving an introduction that explains what tort law is. To do so, there's a couple of things or a couple of concepts that we have to cover. So the first concept that I'll be trying to cover in this video is what is a tort. So I'll be defining what a tort is. Second concept, how a tort is categorized, the different categorizations that are available for torts, the differences to criminal and contract law, and then we'll have a look at torts and statutes, and finally exceptions to torts. Let's start off by defining what a tort is. A tort is, or a simplified definition of a tort, is a civil wrong that is committed by one person against another in society. Now, tort law is generally part of the common law. So just like contract law is part of the common law, tort law again is part of the common law. And when a tort takes place, it's because a person had breached a legally recognized duty that they owe to another person, the person against whom the tort is committed. Now, torts are actionable even if there's no contract that exists between parties. And I'll give an example. Let's say you had two parties, Party A and Party B. Party A commits a tort against Party B. Now, Party B can bring an action in tort against Party A for the tort that Party A had committed, even if there was no contract that existed. So that for a contract to exist between the parties, this is not necessary for an action in tort to be brought against the person committing the tort. So that's the main distinction between tort law and contract law. The categories of tort. Any tort can be classified as belonging to one of these categories. So the first category, the tort of negligence. The second category, trespass to land. Third category, nuisance. And then finally, trespass to person. For the purposes of the construction industry, the most relevant categories are the first three. So negligence, trespass to land, and nuisance. And these are the torts that I will be focusing on. And one thing to point out is the fact that in contract law, we had a unified set of principles, and they apply to different areas of contract law in a similar fashion. When it comes to tort, it's a bit different. Each category has its own set of principles. So when you have a case in tort, what you need to do first is you need to identify the category of the tort. And then once you identify the category of the tort, you apply the set of principles that are applicable for that category. Moving on to explaining the difference between a tort and a crime. Some people might say, well, if a tort is a civil wrong against another individual, how come it's not classified as a crime? What is the difference between a crime and a tort? In other words, the difference is that an action for tort is brought by a person. So the person in this case would be, your plaintiff, the person that was injured. Whereas for criminal law, the crime is brought by the state. So it's the state that would be prosecuting the guilty person. And to demonstrate this, I'll give an example that I've listed down on the slide. Let's say you had a crane operator and there was this tower crane hook that smashed into a bicycle rider adjacent to your construction site. So the operator, due to the negligence of the operator, the tower crane hook hit a bicycle rider, and that bicycle rider got injured. So the bicycle rider over here has two options, or there are two options, two avenues when it comes to the law. There's a criminal act that was committed by the crane operator, and that act will be prosecuted by the state, but also the rider themselves, they can bring an action in tort against the operator, and it's to compensate the rider for the injuries that they would have sustained because of the negligence of the crane operator. So you see over here two areas of the law operating: crime law and tort law. Now, the difference between tort law and contract law, several differences, two mainly differences. So the first difference is the one that I mentioned. In contract law, you have to have a contract for you to be able to bring an action um, against the other party, whereas in tort law, there's no need for a contract. The second difference is the one that relates to the limitation period. What is the limitation period? The limitation period is the maximum period after which you can no longer sue an individual. Now, for both tort law and contract law, the limitation period is 6 years. But there is a slight difference. For tort law, it's 6 years from the date that the damage takes place. So as soon as the damage becomes obvious, this is when the limitation period starts in tort. When we're talking about contract law, it's 6 years from when the breach occurred. And to demonstrate the distinction over here, let's look at an example where you have a concrete slab that is poured. Now, after 1 year, you start to realize cracks in this concrete slab. Based on tort law, the limitation period would start as soon as the cracks become obvious. So that's a year after the concrete slab is poured. When it comes to contract law, it's as soon as the breach had occurred. So the breach would have probably occurred at the time when the slab was poured, and that's when the limitation period would have started uh, for the case of contract law. The case that highlights this is presented on the slides, are highlighted over here for you, a 2014 case. In New South Wales, when it comes to building defects, a maximum limitation period of 10 years was set from the time that the building was complete. So from the time that an occupation certificate is issued, that's when the limitation period starts. And the reason for setting this maximum time period is to avoid issues where, let's say, for example, after 15 years of constructing a building and there are occupants there, the owner then suddenly realizes that there are cracks that started to appear. Now, given that based on tort law, limitation period starts from when the damage becomes obvious, the client can't come and say, well, after 15 years, I've realized that there are cracks. It's not, viable, not feasible to have such issues arise because, it will definitely, there's a lot of sort of cracks that arise due to settlement, etc. So that's why they decided to limit the limitation period. It's 10 years from when the building is complete. And that's the limitation period that's set for defects from the building. Now, tort law is important when it comes to accidents that take place on the construction site. So compensations or damages to pay for the injured party on a construction site. So a contractor can be prosecuted in tort by an injured employee if they can prove that their employer was negligent. So how would the employer be negligent? For example, the employer wouldn't have provided the necessary induction that is needed for people to start working on site, and that's why the employee got injured, and hence they can sue in tort law. Another example is when you have an engineer that designed the building and they did not account for some extra loadings on the building. The building failed, and a third party, an occupant of the building, people that were leasing the premise, they got injured. Now, these third party, they can sue the engineer even though there's no contract that exists between the engineer and the third party, and they can sue that engineer in tort. And most likely what would happen is that they would sue the engineer for negligence. If they were negligent, the engineer would be found to be negligent. So, in this instance, the third party can sue the engineer in tort. In addition, the engineer would be liable in contract. So liable in contract, and in this case, it's the owner that can sue the engineer. And that's because there is definitely will be a contract that would have been established between the owner and the engineer. In this case, the owner can sue the engineer for such damages that had taken place to the building based on contract law. So again, we see an application of two areas of the law that apply to the same case, to the one case. Torts and statutes. So how do statutes govern torts? Well, as I said earlier, torts are mostly in the common law, so they're part of the common law, but there are legislation that is enacted by the government to cover the right to compensation for people that work um, at various places. So in the work environment, people that get injured, the amounts that they need to be paid, and who would be sued for the negligence that had taken place. These are all be covered in legislation. The important legislation in New South Wales is the Civil Liability Act 2002. The Civil Liability Act also limits the circumstances to which a person or party may be liable, negligence, and it determines the damages that are to be paid uh, to the injured party. So it's a very important legislation. Another important legislation that concerns construction is the occupational health and safety laws. Now they impose liability, in this case, on contractors that do not follow provisions that are listed in the statute. So an injured party can sue a contractor that fails to follow the provisions that are listed in the occupational health and safety legislation. So in this case, the injured party is suing outside of torts. So they're suing based on the statute that provides these provisions, and these provisions were not followed by their employer or the contractor that employs them. Finally, exceptions to tort. In some cases, there's an action that would have generally been classified as a tort, but because of these certain exceptions, the action is not implied as a tort by law. What are some examples? Well, the first one, no tortious duty of care owed by a statutory authority. An example of that would be, let's say, a taxation officer. Now, the taxation officer would be allowed to be present at any premise um, at any reasonable time, and they can view any reasonable document that they desire. In general circumstances, this would have been classified as trespass. So, and trespass is part of the tort law. But because they're taxation officers, statutory authorities, they have the exception. So their actions wouldn't be classified as a tort. The second point, if damage occurs as a necessary consequence of something done in performance of a statutory authority. So again, for the taxation officer, if you prevent them from getting into the premise, and in the process of them trying to get into the premise, they damage your fence, that damage had taken place as a consequence of them trying to perform their job, and because they're a statutory authority, that damage wouldn't be classified as a tort. And then finally, people that are injured due to consenting to risk. An example of that would be, people that like bungee jumping. Before you bungee jump, what happens is that you have to sign a waiver, and that waiver is basically you consenting to the risk. So you can't sue, unusual circumstances, you can't sue the operator for any sort of injury that you sustain while you bungee jump because you'd signed the waiver. So this was a list of exceptions to tort. So this video provided a brief overview of what tort law is.